Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. We
Thank you
are,
very much.
our guest today has covered a lot of ground and logged a lot of knots at sea, too, in the course of her life. That includes teaching young children on a small island in the Central Pacific and living aboard a sailing catamaran. She also owned a busy shop and restaurant on the east coast of Australia, taught adults at a school inside a remote prison in northwestern Australia, and volunteered as an ambulance officer in a country district. She used that valuable experience in 2005 to publish Barefoot Roving, a guide to nourishing food and simple preparation while, say, sailing or touring or vacationing far from supermarkets and takeout restaurants and without the benefit of refrigeration. Now she's turned her hand to fiction for the publication of Grasp the Nettle, Australian country life in the 1920s era. It's a slender work, only 64 pages, but it packs a powerful punch. The book is set in a remote district of Western Australia. It opens with a police report that an unidentified body has been found, and the police are treating the death as suspicious. The remainder of the book is told in an epistolary style, though consisting of alternating diary entries rather than letters. I found it as compelling as if a David Attenborough documentary immerses the reader in a world far from our own. Very pleased to welcome the author, Sylvia Lerch.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the chance to reach your listeners.
All right. You've had several different careers, as we just discussed. What turned you to writing?
Well, I'm not as physically fit as I used to be. Although I'm octogenarian, I don't feel old. I just can't do some of the things I used to enjoy doing, like riding horses
Mhm.
and sailing boats and so forth. But I don't feel old. I feel as though I've still got plenty to offer. And writing, of course, is so rewarding. The English language is just so wonderful. And I just thought I'll turn my hand to writing something interesting. And I have been told by many readers that it's the perfect book for book clubs
Ah,
because it's short and packed full of curiosities. So I hope people enjoy it.
is there a chance that you also are a poet? Because I thought there's a certain lyricism behind the rather hard Scrabble life this couple leads.
Yes, I love to write poetry and short stories, and just the English language is such a rich language
Uh,
compared to the language of the Kiribati people, for instance. They have only 9 letters in their alphabet and really only one tense. It's very much a spoken language,
mhm.
whereas our language is so rich in what it can store in the written form. Shakespeare, of course, is the absolute master, and Chaucer's English is out of date or old fashioned, but how rich was his writing, too. I mean, to describe this summoner among the pilgrims, the summoner whose job was to call people to church, to summon them to
Mhm.
church. He's described as well loved he garlic, onions, and he leeks. Imagine his breath.
Yeah.
Who would want to come near somebody reeking of garlic? It's just hilarious what you can read into the words written so long ago by Geoffrey Chaucer. Yeah.
I can sense one of the things I really liked about the book was that the people involved felt like they had a very rich backstory. I mean, they were really fleshed out. Did you do like character studies that didn't get into the book because you needed to feel what they were before you started writing?
Well, that era was brought alive to me growing up because my father was born in 1902 and my mother was born in 1906. So the 1920s era was really the highlight of their life,
Mhm.
I would say. And they had so many stories about that era. And um, I just felt as though I knew the era and I wanted to have a protagonist as a woman, a young woman, um, in limited circumstances and restricted to being able to read only the King James Version of the Bible because she had nothing else to read and so forth. And I I know that diaries were terribly important in those days. It it was a pastime. There was no television or radio or anything, but it was also an expression of elitism, if you like, because not everybody could read and write.
Mhm.
So if you were privileged enough to be able to write, you kept a journal or a diary to kind of prove to yourself that you'd achieved something or you'd had the benefit of education and so forth. And my father inherited his great grandfather's journal written on the ship travelling out from Scotland in 1820. And that is just so interesting to read. And there's so much in the background, not directly written, but you can work out all
Mhm.
sorts of threads in that story. And it was a much longer journal than he expected because the ship left Scotland heading for Cape Town. But when the ship arrived, no one was allowed to disembark because there'd been measles on board.
Oh, okay.
Last time measles got amongst the Negroes, thousands of them died.
Right.
So no one was allowed to disembark to protect the Negroes. So he had to stay aboard for the next port of call, which was Hobart.
Ah,
And Hobart was a very young colony, and no one was expecting free settlers in Hobart in 1820, really.
wow.
And there's lots of information about Tom Scott's life there because he was a prolific journal writer. A lot of his papers and sketches and charts, and he was a surveyor. They're all now in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, which is a library for primary sources of history, documentation like that. And but I remember very vividly reading the original diary written by my great great grandfather. It it seemed very significant to me, and I wanted to incorporate that into my little book. That idea of journals being so important.
What's interesting to me, well, there's so many interesting things. It's a really wonderful read. I'm highly recommending it. One of the things is the contrast between the entries of the husband's journal and the wife's
Yes.
journal. Um,
Yeah,
he tends to write about external things. He's looking at numbers of sheep and what do you
yeah,
have to survive? She's writing about internal things, how she's
yeah.
dealing with all of the things that are happening. And it's a fascinating contrast.
And also another angle along that line. She is the romantic with the um, wonderful ideas of romance and joy and all the rest of it. He is um, stodgily recording data, as you say, but she thinks that when the only compensation, if you like, for him dying is she'll be able to read his journal, and she thinks it's going to be full of poetry because he's out there watching the night sky and things like that. And we, the reader, know that she's not going to find any of that. It's just um, statistics, as you say. And the statistics are genuine. They are taken from a journal written by a man who grew up on a sheep station here
Mm.
in that era or just before then. And he, for some reason, was never able to ride a horse. So
Mm.
in that era, if you couldn't ride a horse, you were really significantly handicapped.
Yeah.
And so the family decided to give him the job of bookkeeper and
Mm.
ledger keeper, records keeper, and he kept prolific records of their sheep station. And those numbers are genuine, the number of
Mhm.
acres you need to support one sheep, because it's
Wow.
very poor country,
Yeah.
and how many bales of wool you get, and the fact that 1 pound in weight of fleece, greasy fleece, that 1 pound paid a white man's wages for a month.
Insane.
Think think of the wealth of the wool industry. It's
Oh,
staggering. Yeah.
It's fascinating. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, you keep the values in line with what it's a different country. The past is a different country. I think one of the writers said that as a they do things differently there. To be immersed in that culture through this book is to really take a trip in time.
It is a different time, and it's a different era in relation to social tolerance or cultural acceptance of gender diversity, for instance. And it's it's too easy for people today to fail to recognize that contraception was a huge issue, absolutely huge issue. And that leads to another thing that has happened since that era. I do honestly believe it's now too easy for people to postpone starting a family.
Mhm.
And a lot of women are now realizing, heavens, I'm past childbearing age. I've never taken advantage of the opportunity given to me by the Creator. And it's irretrievable. And they recognize, I think, that it's a huge mistake. But that's just my opinion. I'm so happy I had children. Childbirth was wonderful.
It is, as somebody said, it's the hardest thing you ever do and the most rewarding thing you ever do is to be a parent. So I
Oh,
appreciate that. Um,
yes, parenting is hard.
we
Mm.
should talk a little bit about the plot because it's essential to this. So we have um, Elsie, who is married Tom. It's an arrangement brokered by her brother. He delivers the Royal Mail and tries to take on other freighting jobs, and he's away from home for weeks at a time. She's in a rather crude place in this bush hut and tries to keep herself occupied and positive all the way through. And without giving away anything, there are some surprises at the ending here that really took me aback, but are actually set up all the way through. So you've done your homework well.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm not going to give away the surprises either,
Uh,
but um, I, I've been told by a number of people that it is a very interesting read because it's curiously different from most novels. The formatting, of course, is essential, and I think it's much easier to read because there's different font used for the different diaries and so forth. You can instantly tell whose document you're reading, or um, that's one of the curiosities. And oh, I've lost the thread of what I was going to talk about. But
it's it, well, it's a wonderful time and place, and one of the things we mentioned is the dependence that married women, the structure of society is so heavily male centered in that time. Women couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, the whole number of things they couldn't do at the time.
they weren't allowed to have a job once they got married.
Mhm.
Because of the First World War, women were allowed to have a job, but if they got married, they had to give up that job. That was the case when I first got married. A married woman wasn't allowed to have an independent income.
Mhm.
And that was largely because of the lack of contraceptives, reliable contraception. It was just automatically supposed that the woman would end up with a full-time job of minding the children and the household and so forth. And one interesting thing has come full circle in this country recently. Women in that era and my era when I was young, women, for the love of their family, looked after under school age children and looked after the elderly.
Mhm.
They did it for the love of their family. And we were told, oh, that's not good enough. You're not getting paid wages. You should be out there in the workforce, gaining experience and being paid wages. And that just shifts that work onto somebody else's shoulders because that work has to be done. But recently in this country, the government increased the wages of two different kinds of workers. They increased the wages of the people looking after under school age children and the wages of people looking after the elderly. So finally, the work that women used to do for love of their family has been recognized as valuable. And I think that's good.
We still have a problem in this country with disparity in wages when they do work. It's
Yes,
yeah, there's about a
and here,
20% difference in that. And I remember arguing with people about saying, well, I'm going to, no, as a man, I'm going to pay, he has a family to support. And I'm thinking, if he's doing the same work, she's doing the same work, she should get the same pay. It's a personal
I
thing.
agree.
That's just my personal view. So um,
Yes,
there are some interesting Tom, who's actually the husband is not he's not as represented quite as much as she is because she's doing more heavy thinking. His is very short and sweet, and when he writes his entries. But one of the things that was a real, I love the telling detail. And when she has a baby, he says, "I'm not going to tell father because it's only a girl." So he
yeah,
is into the patriarchy, absorbed it
yes,
through his skin as a person of that era. Yeah.
absolutely. He also says she can, he will choose the name if it's a son, but she can choose the name if it's only a daughter.
Only a girl. I mean, that's a
Mm,
devastating thing to read and to feel that that was the real attitude of the time. That was,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yes. Well, the eldest son was so important too.
Mhm.
That was a really important thing. That only half that little piece of culture was followed when my eldest brother um, inherited stuff. You see, the eldest son was supposed to inherit everything, but also inherit the task of looking after the siblings.
Mhm.
But too often they just inherited everything and forgot about the siblings.
Yeah.
Anyway, mm,
Um, I want to speak to one of the things that intrigued me. There's a religious thread that works its way through all of this. And I think you
yes,
have said you wanted people who came away from this with an actual chance to open up the Bible for once in a while. Is that correct?
that's correct. Yes. And I have achieved that ambition. Various people have said, gosh, after reading that, I was really curious to find out what the words actually say, because um, too much of the text is selected by the people teaching, and it really should be open to everybody, especially the Old Testament, the Torah. People who follow the Jewish religion should be allowed to have a copy at home and read it whenever they want to. I don't think they do. I think traditionally it's just little bits are revealed to them by the rabbi. And of course, the information is jealously guarded. But the Torah is just showing the way that the Savior is coming, that Christ is coming. He's coming. And so anybody familiar with the Torah should be well equipped to recognize the Christ. And yet they don't seem to be. They deny their own teaching.
I had a little interesting reaction to some of it. And that is there was a line about it says plain as day the Holy Spirit hovered above the water that God had just made. So if we're made in God's image, we must be able to hover, she thinks.
Yeah.
I thought was
Yes,
this is not a standard interpretation. I'll put it that way.
but it's possible, isn't it? I mean, it does make sense if you think about it. And also, um, God must have been able to hover. Um, if there was no planet Earth, there's nothing to stand on. So you would need to be in some other form of existence to exist there. Um, it, I know it's controversial and so forth, and of course,
I'll have to say I've not run into that before, so it was an intriguing thing to me. Also, she mentions that her brother was reading the Gnostic Gospels, and you don't see that often anymore. So, how did you
yeah.
work? What was the idea behind mentioning that?
Oh, because in the Gnostic Gospels there is the Gospel of Thomas, which is not well known at all. But it's not a narrative, it's just a collection of quotations. Thomas just wrote down things that Jesus said, and he must have been scratching his head thinking, gosh, I can't really work this out, but I'll write it down and work it out later. And one of the most interesting things to me is when Jesus is in a crowded house um, where everybody wants him to perform miracles to um, eliminate diseases and so forth. It's so crowded, and his mother Mary comes to the door with with her four sons. You see, she and Joseph had children together after Jesus was born. There was Simon, Joseph, Judas, and I just can't think of the name of the other one. Four sons, and they didn't count the daughters. And someone says to Jesus, your mother and brothers are at the door. They want you to leave this gathering and go with them. And Jesus says, this is reported by Thomas, and I can imagine Jesus pointing to the door. He says, my mother birthed my body. And I can imagine him pointing to the heavens and saying, but my true mother gave me life.
In fact, you quote
Because,
that sentence in there. Yes.
yes, and my protagonist, Elsie, decides that if God is omnipotent, God can't be male only. That's not omnipotence. It has to embrace more than that. And she believes the Holy Spirit is the female component. Well, I think Jesus also is alluding to the fact that God is not male only.
Mhm.
God is mother and father of Jesus. It's
Fascinating. This book originally came out last year, I believe. What has been the reaction to people that read it, that feedback to you? What are they telling you about it?
most of them are not willing to discuss the religious aspects. Too controversial, and many of them are ignorant about the Christian religion. And most people today say, science contradicts religion. Religion is old hat and so forth. But almost, oh, well, I'm not exaggerating when I say all the readers who have read it and contacted me say it's really interesting from a number of angles and the perfect book club book because it's small and intense and so forth and
I,
full of
I,
curiosity.
I love learning little tidbits here, and there's some very practical things in here that if I were to be transported back to Australia in the 20s, I might know about that. Where he talks about, this kind of a hole indicates that there's a scorpion there. This kind of hole indicates that
Yeah,
it's this or that animal, and I'm fascinated by that. That's kind of the bush knowledge you would need to survive
absolutely.
there. Yeah,
Yes, yeah. And learnt the hard way.
yeah,
Yes,
probably. Um,
yes.
there's also some a real poetry in here. I want to read one that got to me. It said, she's writing in the diary. She says, there's another secret closely akin and as closely kept, but equally unknowable without first-hand experience. It is that between mother and about to be born child. The secret is the great mystery of motherhood, understood so well by our forebears, but elbowed out of our contemporary lifestyle. Fascinating and a commentary at the same time.
Yes. And for me, motherhood was the most wonderful experience. Those words are written from first-hand experience. I just loved being pregnant and giving birth. For me, there was no pain in childbirth because I had lessons in how to relax, which was genuine yoga in those days. You learnt to relax and then you just submitted to the process of childbirth, which is a natural thing. And if you let it happen, there's no pain involved. As soon as you are frightened and become tense.
Yes,
That,
that's what it
yeah.
is.
And an example of that is if you clench your fist, you can feel the muscles of your fist clenching, but that's not pain, it's the muscles clenching. You don't, and it's the same with childbirth. You're using muscles that you never use at any other time in your life. So it feels strange. But if you just let it happen, it's it's painless. It happens. And
And, and and you translate that because that's the way Elsie has her child, her daughter,
yeah,
as the
yeah,
same way. And thinking about that, so I can see that that translated into the book, which is your lived experience
absolutely.
passing on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wish I lived in my great grandmother's era when women had a dozen children, or
That's
they were just expected to have however many children turned up. I would have really enjoyed that, but I'm also grateful every day. I give thanks to the Creator that there was never anything wrong with any of my children. I think it must be devastating. You, as a parent, you couldn't help but feel responsible, and yet you're not. It's a bigger sin than that. Destiny is a bigger thing than something governed by a trivial person like myself. But I give thanks every day for healthy, beautiful children.
and that's wonderful. I've been lucky in that regard as well. Both of my kids are doing well. Um, is there more to come? I feel like there should be a story that comes after this that doesn't that should we be looking forward for something else?
I would love to write more. English is such a wonderful language, and so much of it deserves preserving. So many words are falling out of use. Words like uxorious, that wonderful Scrabble word, and petrichor, another wonderful word. The vocabulary is so reduced now, especially now that we're texting each other and abbreviating things. And
Well,
yeah,
pretty soon we won't remember to put apostrophes in because the
oh,
autosave will do it for us, and it's a whole nother thing. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And I treasure the English language. I think it's wonderful. And I would like to write some more. And there's so much more um, information that falls into the grave with old people. I remember taking my mother to a place in New South Wales, which is a sort of living museum, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
It's a gold rush era town site, and the women all swish around in floor length clothes, and the men get around in top hats and whatnot. And
Yeah.
they have a coach pulled by four horses, and they also have a bullock wagon. And I think there's only six bullocks on the bullock wagon, not a dozen the way there used to be in the old days. But I took my mother to this place and I thought it would interest her. Along comes the bullock wagon, and she just said, "Oh, oh, that's so wrong." I said, "What on earth's the matter?" She said, "Oh, I can't look. Take me away." And I said, "What on earth's the matter?" And she explained that that man in the museum was sitting on the empty timber jinker being pulled by the bullocks. And she said the bullockies never, ever, ever expected the bullocks to pull their own weight. They expected the bullocks to pull enormous loads of timber and wool and so forth. Absolutely unbelievable weights that these bullocks were whipped into pulling. But there was this unwritten understanding between the man and his beasts. The man would never expect the beasts to carry his weight. And
Mm.
that's just a tiny bit of information that should be recorded, but it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to have been.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's news to me. I'm glad to know. Add that to the store. Yes.
yeah, in the next book.
All right. Well, if there anything we've not touched on, you want to make sure that our audience gets to know.
Oh, I think the era was far more interesting than people realize. It's always sort of recorded as the fun and games era, but there was a lot more to it, and there were a lot of people in this country who had arrived um, from every other country in the world because of the gold rush.
Mm.
A lot of them were from America, and so there was a huge mixture of cultures and stuff. It was a big melting pot, and uh, yeah, people need to understand too that the church was so important in that era. That was where people went for help. Um, I don't know enough about other religions, but I do know that the Christian religion uh, helped people in need. And that was the first place you went to if you didn't have enough food or you didn't have shelter and so forth. And that meant that the ministers had great power. There were no women ministers, of course. That was another patriarchal thing. Um, and now, of course, the government has taken over the role of social security, but
Mm.
I'm not sure that it's better.
Interesting,
Anyway,
because at least in the small communities, the the minister would know everyone, and
oh, absolutely. Yes.
that's a whole different thing that we're talking
Yeah.
about. I,
Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for a fascinating study that I think has a lot of meaning to it, a lot more than the size of the story would indicate in terms of the page count. And I really want to hope that you will be writing some more and we'll get back together at some point. Our guest today has been Sylvia Lerch. The book is Grasp the Nettle, Australian Country Life in the 1920s era. Thank you so much for a pleasant time.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.